Well, good morning. It's good to have our Bible class back. We're going to be starting off with doing a study in the book of Exodus. So if you want to go ahead and turn your Bibles to Exodus chapter 1, we'll be starting there. We are streaming this online, although I think my email still said 10:30. That was my mistake. I think I wrote in there that Bible class started at 9:30, but neglected to say it was going to be streamed as well. But we'll have the stream going, and we won't turn off, for those who are watching online, we will not turn off the stream after the Bible class. We'll just let it keep running through, all the way through the morning service as well. So, I know that this quarter has got only 2 months, so we'll see how it goes, if we continue with Exodus into the fourth quarter or not. I'm probably going to do this more about following the life of Moses, which pretty much follows through the book of Exodus, and go through it from that standpoint. And I thought a lot about how to start this study, and I thought it might be good to start this by looking at the country, the nation of Egypt, a little bit more specifics than we normally do, to kind of get an idea of the context of what's going on. We open up in Exodus chapters 1, 2, and 3, and we wonder, who are these pharaohs? Who might they be? And how many of you have seen the movie The 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston? I saw that. Like Charlton Heston, he does a great job. And I like seeing biblical events in the movie. And there they did a great job with the plagues of Egypt, and the visuals of seeing Moses parting the Red Sea. Beautiful. And a lot of neat things about the movie. Unfortunately, it's not very accurate. In there, do you remember who Pharaoh was in the movie? Well, not the actor. Who was Pharaoh? Pharaoh who? Ramses, right? They called him Ramses. Well, if I remember correctly, Ramses doesn't come onto the stage probably till about 400 or 500 years after the events of Moses. Now, Ramses that name is used as a title a few times. We know that from Exodus chapter 1 that the people build a city named Ramses, but that is not the name of the pharaoh. Now, we don't know exactly who these pharaohs might be, but we can speculate. We can look at a few things. What I like to do is look at the events of Egypt in that time, look at the secular history, and see what I can find there that seems to line up or match up with what I see in the Bible. And I think I got it. Not that I'm the only one. I've pulled it from other more knowledgeable men than me, from bits and pieces here and there. But I feel fairly confident in who I think these pharaohs are, and hopefully I can impart those thoughts and ideas to you this morning. Now, we're going to start off by talking about the land of Egypt. There's only two great nations at this time, or in the beginning. It's Egypt and Mesopotamia. There are no other great nations. You may remember if you're here on Wednesday nights, we're studying through the book of Genesis and the life of Abraham. And Abraham goes to that city Greer, and there is a king there, but it's a king of that city. And then Sodom had a king. Gomorrah had a king. You had these city-states, very small, with a king. They weren't coming together to make a great nation. Only two are doing that. Mesopotamia, that's where Abraham originally came out of, and then also Egypt. Now, Egypt, in the Hebrews called Egypt, that country, Mesrim, which is the son of Ham. So they probably named it that because the son of Ham is the one that went down there and founded that area. That makes sense. The Egyptians, their name is derived from a Greek word for Memphis. We're in Exodus chapter 1, looking at Exodus and the Egyptian nation. Their name is derived from a Greek word for Memphis, and it means two lands, or the two lands. And there's the reason why they call it the two lands is because the Nile River, dropped off whenever it would flood, dropped off a lot of silt and topsoil, made it very good for agriculture. And then the rest of the country was sand. And so they were calling it the two types of land from that. But there's also another two types of land. You look up here on our map. You have in the north, Lower Egypt, and in the south, Upper Egypt. I know that seems backwards, but that's what they called it. And it keeps messing me up in my mind when I was doing the study, because I kept flipping them. Like Upper Egypt, that's in the, no, that's in the south. So anyway.
Chris, you realize that's because of altitude?
No.
Yes.
Well, yes, but no.
It's the Nile, it's higher in the south, and the Nile River flows north into the Mississippi.
Right, well, okay, yeah, it's altitude, but it's because of the Nile flowing. But anyway, yeah, you got Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. Now, Lower Egypt is what's up there that we know? Yeah, Goshen. That's where the people of Jacob and Joseph lived. They're in that area. Oh, I got it labeled Goshen. And then I have Memphis labeled. I have it in Upper Egypt, but depending on what you read or where you read, it's in Lower Egypt or it's in Upper Egypt. No one's really sure where that line was. And when Egypt first started, the first couple of dynasties, they were united, but they quickly began to kind of branch off into two groups, and little civil wars would occur, and they would always split themselves up between Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. And we'll see that occur here in just a little bit as we work through the dynasties. And a dynasty is just the group of pharaohs in charge at that time and types. So we were talking about the Nile. What's made the Nile River so great in this area? What made it so wonderful? Anyone know?
Water and flooding.
Water and flooding. And not bad flooding. It was, you could almost set your watch to it. It would flood every year perfectly and drop down a new layer of soil. They would fertilize, it would water everything, and it created this lush little area all up the Nile. Not the whole thing, but a good area, and of course all of Goshen, the Lower Egypt area, and just real well agriculture and watered area. And that's important because Egypt doesn't get much rain. And when I say it doesn't get much rain, I mean that in a very, in 2015, I looked this up online, they got a lot of rain in 2015, 0.2 inches. That's it. That's for the whole area of Egypt. They don't get rain. So you remember the first plague was what? Yeah, the blood. They turned the Nile into blood. So how big of a deal was that? If you wake up in the morning and your only source of water is blood, it's going to get your attention because you know it's not going to rain and you're not going to get any water. You're dead in a few days if you don't get that taken care of. So that's a significant event. And the Nile is about a little more than 4,000 miles in length, and it, as Jim was pointing out, it flows from the south up north, going in that direction, which is one of the very few rivers that does that. Here is a list of the dynasties. I know that's small print, it's kind of hard to see and read, but you got the very top up there when the period of Egypt when it first started. The people who put this list together put the years 3,500 to 3,000. Oh, we don't really know. But when they're labeling the sections of time, I think that's pretty close. There's a lot of information, secular history, to kind of help them pinpoint how long a pharaoh was on the throne as king and in charge. I have Joseph labeled there. It's in the period of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. That's the 11th and 12th dynasties. You have a second intermediate period, and then Moses in the New Kingdom of Egypt, and they had put in there a time of famous pharaohs, which is true. Now, there's a lot of names I'm going to mention. I struggle pronouncing these pharaoh names. It's difficult, so I will butcher it. If you think you can do better, let me know, and we'll try to go with what works best on the naming conventions here. So Joseph, I think I have him here. Sesostris, what I got? The second there. Sesostris the second. Does that sound right? Sesostris. Yeah, I got a few heads shaking yes. There's an image of him. I believe that is the pharaoh that Joseph came in contact with. Either him or Sesostris the first. I'm not sure. either way, when he comes in, I'm looking at the dates here, and I did a little bit of math. With Joseph being there, and after his death and the generation of that death, puts us about 450 years before Moses comes onto the stage. And so that seems to fit. And a lot of people think it was Sesostris II. I think it could be him or the first, because it's so, you got, in order for the dates to work, the 430 years to fit in there, it's going to be close. It's really close to that time period. And so there's him. Joseph comes down there. Of course, he brings his family. They get put up there in Goshen, and things seem to be going pretty good for them. And the middle kingdom of Egypt, that time period when he gets there, is getting ready to come to an end. And Egypt's doing well. Like I said, they're only one of two great nations, so the little city-states can't do much to them. It's easy for Egypt to spread its influence across the world, but they're not the most powerful nation. Mesopotamia is more powerful, and they got to be careful. They could get taken down if somebody really wanted to. And of course, we know what happens in the time of Joseph with the 7 years of famine and 7 years of plenty. And the 7 years of famine is pretty significant. Again, Egypt doesn't get rain. They have to rely on the Nile to flood. So if it doesn't rain in Africa, it's not going to flood into the Nile, which would in turn flood the Nile up in the Goshen area. So for it to not flood means there's a lot of places down south of them not getting rain. But we also know up in the northeast, where Jacob and his family were, they weren't getting any rain either. The famine seemed to be pretty significant across all the known world, and everybody was being affected. So for them to have food, all the city-states and other people would have to come to them for that food. Of course, they're buying it, and they're getting flush with money. But they don't have a huge standing army. They're not a massive nation. So when things begin to settle down, as we start to work through the dynasties, and Joseph dies, and all of his family dies, and it's just the Israelites are growing in number. And again, we go back to the map. They're up there in the lower Egypt. There begins to be some unrest. Egypt's flush with money. There's people who want to do different things. I'm not going to get into all the politics of it. But there's a small civil war. And those in lower Egypt decide, we don't agree with what's going on in upper Egypt. We're separating ourselves. The current ruling class does. And they no longer recognize the Pharaoh in upper Egypt. And they split, and there's a time of two dynasties happening at once. So now with the nation divided, it is ripe to be picked up by some larger city-states or groups that may come together to come and take some cities. And I think you pronounce this name Hyksos, Hyksos, it's a people. They come from the north, and they enter into lower Egypt at this time of unrest, and they pretty much just take it. I think this is the beginning of the oppression of the Israelites. I think maybe the family of Jacob was probably working with the current ruling class as they separated from the upper Egypt, and now this other group of people come in and they take lower Egypt. And then they slowly start picking up cities in upper Egypt until they take Memphis, the capital, and they wipe out that current dynasty, and they start to set up their own. And that brings us into the second intermediary period. The 13th, 14th, and the 15th is where the pharaohs are another foreign people sitting on the throne. And it's a time of weakness for Egypt as they continue to battle it out. By the time you get to the 17th dynasty, the old ruling class of upper Egypt takes out some of the Hyksos people and eventually wipes them out from both upper and lower Egypt, pushing them out of the country. And the pure Egyptians, who are not mingled with foreigners, begins to sit on the throne. And that brings us into what is called the New Kingdom of Egypt. Hamas the first is that first pharaoh to really unite the country. And he begins to greatly work on the Egyptian influence in all the city-states around the known world. And that grows from there until we get, and as we move along, we come to Thutmose the First. Thutmose the first is the first Pharaoh I think that we come in contact with in Exodus chapter 1. In Exodus chapters 1, 2, and 3, I think we run into 4 different pharaohs, and we're going to look at that next. So Thutmose the first, let's read, actually, verses 1, we'll read 1 through 7, and then we'll read 8 to 14 in a moment. Exodus chapter 1, starting in verse 1. Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came each one with his household, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number, but Joseph was already in Egypt. Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation, but the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. So the Lord was watching over them. He was blessing them, allowing them to grow in numbers, and that's probably why they had so much influence, I think, on that current Pharaoh who was in charge, Sesteros, and his following line. But it created a division amongst the Egyptians, and that's why one of the reasons why I think there was probably a small little civil war. Now, the word now, the very first word we see there, now, these are the names. In the Hebrew, it literally starts off, and these are the names. Because the book of Exodus just continues the story of Genesis. It's meant to be all one piece, but we broke them up into 2. It naturally fits as 2 separate books here. But it is a continuation of the story of Genesis. It was meant to go on at this point. The Hebrew Bible titles this book. Anyone know what they title this? They don't call it Exodus like we do. That comes from chapter 6, I think. They called it the Book of Names because they like to label their books with the first word of the book, and that would be names. So this is called the Book of Names in the Hebrew Bible. We're in Exodus chapter 1. Now look at verses 8 through 14. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply, and in the event of war, they will also join themselves to those who hate us, and fight against us, and depart from the land." So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor, and they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were a dread of the sons of Israel. So they were in dread of the sons of Israel. The Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks, and at all kinds of labor in the field. All their labors which they rigorously imposed on them. So a new king arose who did not know Joseph. Not literally did not know, but didn't care about Joseph or all that Joseph had done for Egypt. A new king arose who, I think, looked back at Egypt at what it was before the time of Abraham, all the way back when it was building the pyramids, and they were considered, in their minds, pure Egyptians. They wanted to get rid of these mixed lines and go back to a pure Egyptian rule. And they know that the Israelites, under Sosostris and during the middle period, they were a mixed pharaohs. They were not pure Egyptians, and that the Israelites, they probably thought, were part of the reason there was civil war, which allowed people to come in to take the land, and they didn't want that to happen again. So they were going to oppress the people, and it begins in a stronger way. I think it had already started before this point, but he wanted to push it a little bit further, making them full-on slaves. And so the oppression began there with Thutmose the first. Now he is going to father, obviously Thutmose the second. He's also going to have a daughter as well, and then his son Thutmose the second will have a son, Thutmose the third, and he will be the Pharaoh that Moses deals with when he comes back at 80 years of age. So Thutmose I is on the throne. He sees what's going on with Israel. He doesn't want to have the same problems they had in the past, and so he wants to make their labors more difficult. So they start to make them build the cities. So now you have a nation that's revitalized. They have a lot of money. They have millions of slaves building cities for them. And Thutmose I, he has quite a few military campaigns, but not a lot. But he begins to spread the influence of Egypt. Influence in the sense that they're going to these little city-state nations and making them pay tribute. Remember when Israel would always have to pay tribute to different countries just to pretty much pay them off so they don't come and blow them away is what it is. And so Egypt is doing that with a lot of smaller city-states at this point and spreading their influence. Then any comments or questions before I move on? Am I going too fast? Does that make sense? We're on Thutmose I, verse 15. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other name was Puah. And he said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth, and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, Why have you done this thing and let the boys live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. Man, all right. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty, because the midwives feared God. He established households for them. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, Every son who is born to you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. Now, when you read that sentence, it sounds like he's talking to all his people, even the Egyptians. He's not. He's only talking to the Israelites. Remember, he started off talking to who? The midwives. He recognized, the best way to do this is try to keep it as under the radar as we can. When you see a kid born, just dispatch it if it's a boy. Kill it. And they said, we're not going to do that. So God recognized that, blessed them for it. When that didn't work, then he just told the Israelites outright, when a boy is born, you throw him into the Nile River. And I'm sure he gave some incentives for that as well, in the sense that if you don't do this, I'm going to punish you in one way or another. So they began to, some of them, throw their children into the Nile River. How horrible that must have been. And so that started with Thutmose I. He reigns for a while. Eventually he dies, and his son, Thutmose II, takes the throne. He does not live very long. His sister, whose name I cannot pronounce, that's here at the top. Hatshepsut? Anybody? What? Do you know her? Oh, you were studied by her in school? Okay. She is, the second pharaoh to sit on the throne in Egypt. She's the sister of Thutmose II. So she's just standing by. Now, Thutmose II has a son, Thutmose III. And again, he doesn't live long. He dies. And his son, Thutmose III, is too young to take the throne. So she sits as pharaoh, as co-regent with him. But she's very popular among the people. People really like her, and she likes power and doesn't want to let go of the throne. So Thutmose III, when he gets of age, recognizes this, and he has her deposed. But that's going too far ahead. Let's backtrack a little bit. We're in chapter 2 of Exodus. Say it again there, Blake. Hat. We'll just call her Hat. Hat is, she's not Pharaoh. Her father is still alive, Thutmose I. In chapter 2, verse 1. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket and covered it over with tar and pitch. Then she put the child into it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sisters stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. Who wrote the book of Exodus? Moses did. Yeah, Moses. Now, you notice in chapter 1, the midwives, when it shows that they feared God, and God recognized that, and he blessed them, and even established their house, and they were named, weren't they? And you remember at the time of Jesus, when the woman came in, crying over Jesus, pouring ointment on his feet and drying it with her hair, and the disciples were indignant at this. And what did Jesus say to her of her? She would be known. People will remember her because of what she's done. Do you know something strange about chapter 2, about Moses' parents? They're not named. Even later on, she will not be named. Just her mother or Moses' mother. And Moses is the one writing this. He doesn't even put their names down. Why? I don't know. All we can do is speculate. But she knew that what the Pharaoh's edict was, you kill the boys. She didn't want to. Now Miriam is the oldest. She's the sister watching. And she's going to have another son younger than Moses. She's going to keep him alive, Aaron. But she doesn't want to get rid of Moses. But what is she supposed to do with the boy according to Pharaoh? Throw him in the Nile. What does she do? Put him in the Nile, but in a basket. But she puts him in the Nile and sticks him in the reeds. Now, in the movie with Charlton Heston, you see her putting him in the basket, pushes it out there, and it floats down to the daughter of Pharaoh. That's not what happens. She hides him in the reeds. Now, the daughter, whether it was the mother told her to watch or she did this on her own, we don't know. She's watching, and this is what happens in verse 5. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile with her maidens, walking alongside the Nile. And she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid, and she brought it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying. And she had pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. The child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, and said, "Because I drew him out of the water." And then the story continues further down the line after that. So again, we see that Moses' mother was mentioned, not by name, but she did get to nurse her son, bring him up. And who all knew that Moses was a Hebrew? Everybody. Everyone knew. Pharaoh's daughter knew. Pharaoh knew. Everyone knew he was a Hebrew. Moses knew. If you watch the movie again, they make a drama of it, and that no one knew until he found out toward the end. But everyone knew, and you could tell he was a Hebrew because they looked different from the Egyptians. And so why do you think Pharaoh's daughter was able to convince Pharaoh to let her keep this Hebrew boy? She was popular among the people. She carried a lot of weight. She was, and of course we can see what's going to happen with her later down the line. She's going to end up being a pharaoh for several years, well, for a little while, until she's deposed by her nephew, Thutmose III. So she raises Moses. And how old is Moses when he leaves Egypt? 40 years old. How old is he when he comes back? He's 80. So we're not going to read it because we're going to get more into detail on this next week. But let's go ahead and read the next section. So verse 11. Now it came about in those days when Moses had grown up that he went out to his brethren and looked on their hard labors, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that, and when he saw that there was no one around, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He went out the next day, and behold, 2 Hebrews were fighting with each other. And he said to the offender, "Why are you striking your companion?" But he said, "Who made you a prince or a judge over us? Are you intending to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and said, "Surely the matter has become known." When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Why? Have you ever wondered why did the Hebrew people treat Moses like that? I mean, if he's trying to help them out, well, go ahead. Jealous? Yeah, because of where he's at. Is he being punished? Is he being forced to build and work on these cities? No, he's living in the palace. He's living the life of a king. He's doing great, and he's being taught by them. So they probably see him kind of like a traitor. He's the turncoat, maybe. You know, how can you come down here and judge us? You don't even live among us. Who are you? In their minds, probably they think of him as just another Egyptian. And when things didn't... Now why did Moses do this? What was he thinking?
My people.
Oh, they're my people. I wonder if he thinks that he is that one that's going to bring people out of slavery. Because I think they know about the vision of Abraham. Those stories were passed down. And he's probably wondering if he's the guy. But people rejected him. He's trying to do it his way, isn't he? And it's not working. So he flees and he runs when Pharaoh tries to kill him. And of course, we know that that stepmother, the second, the mother hat, she would not like that or want that to happen. So he flees, he goes off to Midian. While he's there, Thutmose II dies. He doesn't rule very long. That's Hat's brother. So she's now co-regent with her nephew, Thutmose III. And as he gets older, he deposes of her. So while Moses is living in Midian, his adoptive mother is Pharaoh over Egypt, but she doesn't live long before she's disposed. She's killed, and Thutmose III takes the throne. Now when he takes the throne, he is a great tactician. He is considered by all secular historians as the greatest pharaoh who sat on the throne in Egypt. His military campaigns were quick. He was a great tactician. He was doing them again and again and again, greatly spreading the influence of Egypt, and definitely they became the most powerful nation, much greater than Mesopotamia, and everyone feared them. They had lots of money, they had lots of resources, they had lots of slaves, they had a huge army. And he was just doing campaign after campaign after campaign, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, for the last 15 so years of his reign, it ended. No more military campaigns. It just stopped in secular history. Why?
Army drowned.
His army drowned. He lost almost his entire army chasing after the Israelites to bring them back. And of course, God brought the Red Sea, Sea of Reeds, down upon them, and they drowned. And Egypt's influence was still strong. They still had a lot of money. They didn't have their slaves. They still had people, and they had some armies they were able to muster up, and they kept spreading influence. But after Thutmose III, it began to decline. I think it's either the second or the third pharaoh after him. There's a sharp drop of Egypt's influence and power. It just kind of falls off the side, and eventually they just become an obscure nation with little to no influence at all. So all of that tells me that this is probably the Pharaoh that Moses deals with. And it all falls in line real well, in my mind, with the events of Joseph, the events of Moses and the family, with those last three, especially with the female Pharaoh Hat. And it all falls in line well for me. So I think that's the way all these things played out. And so here he is. He's Thutmose III on the throne. He is a powerful pharaoh. He's greatly spreading the influence of Egypt. Do you think the people like him? Yeah. I mean, if we had a king or one of our leaders here in our nation, in America, it greatly increased our wealth, greatly increased our influence, greatly increased our security. We would like him, right? Wouldn't we? In fact, Egypt was never more powerful than it was now. No one could touch him. They loved him. They saw him as a god. And so that's why when Moses came and the first plague hit, did it rattle people? It did. But they didn't call on Pharaoh to give up. It took a couple of plagues before the people of the nation began to call on Thutmose III to let the people go. But he was too arrogant. Because if he let them go, what would happen to the influence of Egypt? All that he built, all that he had done, he'd lose it. He would lose all of that. And he saw and he recognized that. That's why even after he let them go, he took his army, even though it was clearly he could not beat God, he still chased after the Israelites with his army to bring them back. Because he saw that everything was lost if he loses them. That Egypt's influence was going to be diminished. He needed to have them back. He was an arrogant man. He saw himself as a god. And of course, he also, as we'll get there, saw them wandering around back and forth in the wilderness and thought they're confused and lost. This is the good time to go get them. And he was wrong. But we'll get to that later. So, any thoughts or comments, questions in this section? Okay. Well, that's what I think is happening. And so I see 4 different pharaohs that we're dealing with in these first 3 chapters of Exodus. And of course, all throughout with the plagues, the 4th one being Thutmose III. And it seems to fit. Again, it's speculation, but it does seem to fit with the timeline of the Bible. And so that's how I see it. That's how I'm going to approach this. It doesn't really matter because God gave us the information we need to know and understand the story of these people and how they progress along as he helps them and brings them out of the land of slavery there in Egypt. And of course, when they leave, we're going to follow them through the Red Sea, in the Sinai Peninsula there, and then eventually into the Promised Land if we make it that far in these 2 months. Well, I got about 5 minutes left. No comments, no questions? None at all. All right, yes?
Does the secular history talk much about the 7 years of famine and the 7 years of plenty?
I haven't researched that yet. I'm going to assume no. I spent most of my time looking this up at this point, but I can go back and take a look at that. I remember when I went through Joseph in the past, I don't remember coming across anything in secular history dealing with that or talking about that. The only thing is that we see is that at that time, Egypt was doing well. And then after that time, they had a civil war, and then the Hyksos people, I don't know if you were in here for that, the Hyksos people came in and took over lower Egypt and then eventually upper Egypt. And why those things occurred, we don't know, but we don't see. Oh, one thing I did forget to mention, one of the things that happens a lot in Egyptian history, that happens with a lot of these older nations, was when you didn't like somebody, you expunged them from the record. Thutmose III did not like his aunt. He tried to erase her from history. He was not successful in that because the people really liked her. They really liked her. But after the people Israelites leave Egypt, no one in Egypt liked the Israelites after what had happened. And so they expunged them from history, from their record, as much as they possibly could. And we can't find much of anything. There is, all scholars, even and those who don't believe in the Bible, they all admit that the Egyptians had a slave class. They know they had a slave class, but there is no record about the slave class whatsoever. And so that has to be, I think, the Israelites. Some try to say it's the Hyksos people that after they defeated them, they kept them as slaves, but there's no record to prove that either way either. So generally they would wipe out the history of another group that they did not like. And that's why we have a hard time finding out all the information we want to know about Egyptology. It's a difficult pass to look up, even though they were a pretty well advanced nation. Oh, another tidbit. On the pyramids, the pyramids came in pretty early. So when Abraham, if you were here on Wednesday nights, when Abraham went down there to Egypt during that first famine, the pyramids were already built. So he got to see those things. So did Joseph and the others. I always thought that would be interesting that they built that in the very beginnings, but they gave up on that later on, which is understandable because I find that to be quite a useless building if you think about what they used them for. That was a lot of work for nothing. Okay. If there's no more comments, no, one more question, Jan? Yeah, they're, well, they probably make them look young, but they generally took the office or the position after their father died, and they are typically fairly young when they do, like Thutmose III was fairly young, but they never, most of the time before Thutmose III, they would live a long time. No one would kill them. They were, there wasn't much assassination. After this point, it's going to happen a lot. There's a lot of civil war after Thutmose III. A lot of infighting is going to occur in civil war, and which all will help lead to the downfall of Egypt as a great nation. But yeah, they're generally young, some probably mid-20s or 30s when their fathers died. They would usually die around between 50 and 60 is about how long they would live.
Yeah, you have several pharaohs who could confirm when they were there before they were even teenagers.
Yeah, like Thutmose III, and they would have a co-regents, and
King Tut was like, I can't remember.
yeah, just a kid.
27.
Yeah, but that's toward the end of the nation when it eventually collapsed after.
I thought he was really young as well. If memory serves.
Oh yeah, Thutmose III. Yeah, he was so when his father Thutmose II died, he was too young, and his mother served as a co-regent. But he, as soon as he could, he deposed her. Huh?
But he was a name though, and she would.
Oh yeah.
Right.
He was named Pharaoh. She was a co-regent, but she tried to take it. She wanted. That's why she got deposed. And he knew it, and others did as well. But she was still well liked by the people. All right, good comments. Yeah, Egypt's history is rich, pretty full. And when you look closely at it, you can see that there is something happening in there that fits the timeline with what's going on in the Bible. So I think it's a good study. It's a good way to start off as we work our way through the book of Exodus. And next week we'll start into Moses over there in Egypt at the burning bush. Feel free to read ahead. All right, thank you. Oh.
Leave that picture up for a second.